and therefore we do need to speak into the microphones. We will call to order this meeting of the Water Allocation Committee of the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission. And thank you all for being here. We're going to start with a reading of the conflict of interest statement. The General Statutes 138:15 mandates that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict with respect to the matters that are to come before this committee at this time. If any member knows of a conflict or appearance of conflict, please so state at this time. This is, the agenda consists of an information item. I can't imagine that there would be a way to have a conflict of interest. I see none, so we will move on. Thank you. Thank you. And then the next order of business is approval of the minutes if we can remember back to March 10th. In May, in July, in September, we did not have meetings. There were no agenda items. And so now in the November meeting, we're approving the March 10 minutes. That was an interesting meeting that we had 3 really great presentations in. There was no action item. Does anyone have any corrections or observations on those minutes? Do we have a motion for approval? Okay. Commissioner Anderson moves approval. Do we have a second? Dies for lack of second.
Second.
Okay. Commissioner Keene. Okay. All in favor of approval of the minutes as presented, say aye. Any opposed, say no. The motion carries unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Great. All right. Now, on our agenda, we have one item, and it's not an action item, it's an information item. Here we are. And it is a presentation on our IBT, Interbasin Transfer program. And, pardon me, Harold Brady is going to come forward and give us this presentation. Thank you. Harold, it's over to you.
Mic up. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm like most folks, I'm very pleased to be having an in-person meeting, seeing everybody. It's been a couple of years now. So I will be speaking on, this will be the IBT update. So we do this at least annually, and then also during when there's issues that come up or regarding interbasin transfers. Okay, so quick outline. I haven't done this in a while, or we haven't done this. I'm the, I should say who I am. I'm Harold Brady. I'm the Water Supply Development Coordinator and the Interim Interbasin Transfer Coordinator for the Division of Water Resources. We haven't done this in a while where we go through what is IBT, sort of a 101 primer on walking through what is an interbasin transfer, what the statute says what we have to follow, and things like that. So I'm going to go through that first. And it's the same presentation that I gave at public meetings back last year, last fall, about this time, for a project that I'll discuss in the second half, which is the Town of Hugh Wave Arena IBT request. And then the last part of it will be a discussion of the draft interbasin transfer rules that are being developed right now. And if anybody has any questions as I go through it, please feel free to ask those questions. All right, so interbasin transfer, the definition and purpose. It is the withdrawal of surface water from one river basin to another river basin, the discharge of all or part of that water in that of the river basin. And in a basic statement, the purpose of the law is to ensure that it is good public policy to move water from one river basin to another for the purpose set forth. The statute. What does the statute say about interbasin transfers? So there's 3 provisions or requirements that will kick somebody into getting a certificate The first one is the primary way water systems or entities have to get a certificate, interbasin transfer certificate. So it's 2 million gallons or more, calculated as the daily average of a calendar month. So we look at it, and we look at the max month and what that average daily amount is over the max month of a year. And if it exceeds 2 million gallons a day, then it's time to get a interbasin transfer certificate. There's also the provision of it cannot exceed. So if you have a water system that the average is below 2 MGD, they cannot exceed 3 MGD without having to come get a certificate on their peaking. The other two have to deal with, there's the grandfather, let's see, increase the amount of transfer by 25%. That July 93 has to do with the grandfather ruling. That's when the statute came in. There is a grandfathered allowance for systems that already had distribution systems in the ground in 1993. And then number 3, if you exceed the amount, if an entity exceeds the amount issued in a certificate. Okay. This is real basic here, what an interbasin transfer is. So it's important to know that the transfer it's a net transfer and not the gross transfer. So it's the withdrawal minus the return. So we have a couple of examples here. We've got a source basin I'm going to go through the top one first. The source basin is on the bottom part of the slide. So that town is moving 10 million gallons a day into the service area. So that green circle represents the service area of the town. Okay, and the line that cuts right through the town is the Basin Divide. Okay, so they use 2 million gallons inside their service area as a consumptive use. So that's going to be irrigating water or septic systems or things that go into the ground that aren't collected in a discharge system. 3 goes on the other side of that Basin Divide, so into what we call the receiving basin. There's another 5 that's discharged through typically a wastewater treatment plant into that receiving basin water. So the interbasin transfer in that example is 8 and not 10. The bottom graph is another good example of things we'll see. That town, the difference in that bottom one is, as you can see, the basin boundary is completely outside of the town. So all the water that's moving over goes into the receiving basin. All that 10 MGD, million gallons a day, goes into the receiving basin. The consumptive use, like I said, that's irrigation, septic systems, things like that. Remains 5, but that's all in the receiving basin. And their wastewater plant carries it back to the source basin. The interbasin transfer here is 5, and we require a certificate, even though they are returning their return flows back to the source basin. What's used consumptively on the land remains over 2 MGD. Okay. So I just talked a lot about the basin boundaries and where water systems fall within that. Here's the map that is in the statute. It doesn't exactly follow a HUC map, a HUC boundary map. This was done by the General Assembly when the statute was passed in 1993. And you can see there's broken out into 18 major basins across the state. And I said it doesn't exactly follow the HUC maps, but it's pretty close. In most all places, it's pretty close. It follows the divides that you would see in a typical basin boundary hydrologic unit code map. Okay. Just some points to know about water transfers in North Carolina. There's over 130 public water systems that have some type of transfer. So most towns, a lot of towns across the nation, everywhere, will build on the high point on the land as opposed to down in the valley. And so the result of that is part of their service area is in one basin, and part of it is in another basin. But 80% of those are under 1 million gallon a day. So most of those small towns across the state, very low amounts, they don't meet that threshold for the 2 MGD to come to us to look for a certificate. But however, there have been 9 IBT certificates issued since '93. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a grandfathered allowance for systems that are transferring over that 2 MGD prior to July '93 when the statute was enacted. A couple dozen systems fall into this grandfathered allowance. There are a handful of water systems that transfer between 1 and 2 MGD, and those are on our radar, specifically the branch that I work in, water supply planning, through our local water supply planning program. We will reach out to the systems, request water balances to make sure that they are in compliance. And if they get to within 80% of that 2 MGD, the threshold, then they need to start working towards either getting a certificate or avoiding any further interbasin transfers. Okay. Here are the 9 systems. First of all, you have Piedmont Triad. That's Lake Randall to result of that. Charlotte in '02, Concord Kannapolis in '07. Greenville Utilities in 2010. Brunswick County was the first one that I worked on. In 2013, Cary and Apex. 15 as well as in 2015, Carr Regional received a certificate. Union County received one in 2017. That was for a project where they were drawing water out of Tillery to the county. And then the most recent one was Pender County in 2018. The process. So it can be the statute is very prescriptive. It's fairly long for what this is, and it can be complicated. We broke it down into three primary steps. You've got the notice of intent. You can see there's some public meetings that are held by the applicant through that process. The second step is the draft environmental document. It's the middle of a draft of an environmental document. There's a public hearing associated with that as well. And then ultimately the department will issue a record of decision or a FONSI, depending on whether it's an EA or an EIS. The third step is the petition document. It's different from the environmental document. And that goes to the EMC as really the formal request. And so it takes that technical information that was in that environmental document and moves it forward into a very technical request to the EMC for the certificate with a specific amount and conditions are in there. There are at least 2 public hearings associated with that process. I'm talking about in the source basin and the receiving basin. And you can see here, it's complicated where the EMC issues a draft determination prior to those public hearings, and then there's comments accepted. And then after all that process, the EMC issues a final determination. And this is important here. So the decision considerations for that determination by the EMC. So the statute provides a lot of flexibility here with this, where the EMC can grant in whole or in part, can deny the request, and can require mitigation measures to minimize any impacts or detrimental effects that have been identified through that environmental process or even through that petition process. So there are 9 things that the EMC by the statute is required to consider when you're making that decision. The first one has to do with the purpose and need of the project. often that's outlined in that environmental document early on, but it's also reiterated in the petition document. The second part is what are the detrimental effects or impacts to the source basin by moving waters from one basin to another? And then what are the cumulative effects on that source basin? So not just so 2 would be more of the direct effects. 3 would be more of the indirect, cumulative effects or impacts from to the source basin from this proposed transfer. 4 really kind of wraps up 2 and 3, but is looking at the receiving basin. So it's also looking at those direct and foreseeable impacts and effects. 5 is an evaluation of all of the alternatives, and the alternatives are laid out in that environmental document early on in the process. And when new alternatives come to light, then those are evaluated as well. The use of impoundment storage capacity, depending on whether that's applicable. Similarly, the use of an allocation out of a Corps of Engineer reservoir. So there's 3 Corps reservoirs in the state, and so in some instances that comes into play here. 8 is really asking the question of how does the service area lie on the boundary, on the basin boundary? How much of it's in the receiving basin? How much is in the source basin? We saw in the earlier example where that certainly changes on water system project by project. And very importantly, 9 allows the EMC to consider any other facts or circumstances that are deemed necessary. So once again, provides this body a fair amount of leeway. Okay, so I mentioned there are conditions that are put on, and the EMC can certainly put conditions in that certificate. There are conditions that are in the statute that will be included on all certificates. So I'm going to go through there's 3 primary plans. There's a water conservation plan, a drought management plan, and a compliance and monitoring plan that are submitted through the process. So at Pender County, when the last one that went through, those plans were provided during that the petition phase, sort of draft plans provided to the body to look at. Those are generally approved by the division itself. The quarterly monitoring reports, that goes into that compliance and monitoring plan, but quarterly monitoring reports are required for transfers. The ability to reopen, amend, and modify. This is a very key thing to keep in mind, that if new information comes to light, the statute demands that there's a possibility for the commission to change the certificate as needed. The last point here is the no selling of transferred water to systems that are not listed as co-applicants. So in the statute, it talks about applicants and co-applicants. Those entities need to be defined and brought forward in the petition document, such that moving forward, there's no selling of that transferred water to folks who are not listed in that certificate, petition and the certificate. And as I said earlier, the EMC can impose additional conditions, and in the past has imposed additional conditions as necessary. I moved to that rather quickly. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the next?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Brady. Let's do pause for a minute for questions there. I also will point out that Councilor Reynolds has just reminded me we're supposed to wear our masks. I don't know if that includes when we're speaking, but generally we are required to wear masks in this building. Is that correct? Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you for this great run through. Do people have questions about interbasin transfer processes? We are going to be undertaking one of these in the months ahead. We don't know exactly when. There may be questions.
I have a question for clarity.
Yeah.
Ask
Take it off.
council, can I take my mask off when I speak?
I think that's at the discretion of the chair. It's just that in the state buildings, the signs are still posted that we have to wear them otherwise, but
All right,
yeah,
let's
so-
take them off to speak.
Thank you.
All right.
On the maps, can you go back to that slide, please, on identifying the regions of the state? Just for clarity and understanding on my part, there are two pieces on eastern North Carolina that, several basins in eastern North Carolina that come in play with the sounds and with the ocean. So seawater rise, one, and active storm systems, floods pertaining to surface water. So the source, would that be indirect seawater rise and hurricanes? Because if this, again, I'll go back to that question, but in 1993, the General Assembly created all of these and the lines and the process. So over time, we've seen sea level rise and we've seen extreme storm systems that have affected directly or indirectly the basins. I guess that would be my first question for staff or for clarity. Do you identify these basins with this source, whether it be direct or indirect?
So we follow this map. And so if there's changing, if the system is changing, we're still compelled to follow this map.
Okay, as you follow the map, then when it comes to your finding of facts, that would be another slide. Could you go to that one, please? So when you find the facts and you are to possibly the source basin number two, foreseeable effects of the source, which would be sea level rise or storms, hurricanes.
Okay. So we would still, until the General Assembly were to change those maps, those basin boundary maps, we would follow those maps. Now when we're talking about how waters may be changing from, as you mentioned, sea level rise or strong storm events, those records then go into what would be used for a lot of the impact assessment, which is the hydrologic model.
Mhm.
And so that capturing of the large events would show up in the hydrologic model, the results from the hydrologic model. So, it looks back on historic data and projects what the future might look like.
Okay. So when you go to the modifying, has the department looked at this series of events over since 93 to possibly look at grading some of these basins when moving forward with applications?
By grading, do you mean changing the line or?
Well, it says a number, modifying. Where am I? Is that a next? Thank you. Yes. So when we look to modify, do we pull these factors in the puzzle, the play? What?
So that reopener clause, in my time and looking back at the history, has never been used for a certificate. There has been a modification to an existing certificate that was Carry Apex.
Mhm.
That they were requesting more water, more transferred water. I haven't been a part of any conversation where we've talked about the need to change the basin lines based upon changes to the environment that we've seen over the past 20 years or so. I hope I'm answering.
I think just as a committee member moving forward, that when some of these basins are looked at in study, that all the basins aren't alike. And when you have sea level rise on the eastern part, I did not see the number of basins that actually come into play. I would have to go back to the map and see that, the number out of, how many basins, 13?
There's 18 major
18.
basins, and
How many border the coast?
let's see. So you have the Lumber, Cape Fear, Noose, White Oak, Tar, and Albemarle.
So there are several basins that affect and can back up toward the central part, depending on the storm, sea level rise. And if there's a stopgap anywhere inland into the sounds, that's going to affect surface waters temporarily or long term, then I was just wondering if it could be part of a study or part of the process in looking at potential or modifying in the future.
I think all concerns, yes, could or will be evaluated and looked at.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
All right.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. for
Thank you,
that.
Commissioner King. Are there other questions? I have a couple. Mr. Brady, on slide 9, which shows the IBT process, it's got all the arrows and boxes. On it, across the top, the applicant submits a notice of intent to file a petition. The applicant perhaps has framed what they intend to apply for, but hasn't submitted an application yet at this point. I'm just taking comments on the concept of transferring a certain amount of water from basin to basin. Is that right?
That's a great way of putting it right there. It's not necessarily an application. It's maybe you could think of it as putting the EMC and the department on notice.
Okay.
It's a notice of intent
Okay.
that this is something that we are moving forward with a request for an interbasin transfer. This is from our preliminary data. This is what we think we're going to need to transfer moving forward. This is where we think we're going to get it from. And so we hold public meetings. These are applicant held public meetings. All the public hearings that follow are held by the commission and the department.
Okay.
After that, this first phase is really the applicant driven process, where they're reaching out to the public, going to certainly the receiving, having meetings in the receiving basin and the source basin, and in places where you can maybe draw some people, where you suspect maybe there might be people who have concerns about this proposed project, to begin letting the people know about this project and hearing the comments. And so I said citizens, but there's a lot water systems, large industry will jump in. It's a wide breadth of people and groups who respond to the comments.
Okay, so these preliminary public hearings held by the applicant, I take it they're required to do so. That gets the word out, and also some comments come in, which perhaps then informs the subsequent preparation of the environmental impact statement.
Absolutely. So the applicant, the applicant and the department receive those comments,
Mm-hmm.
and so it is to help direct how that. They know issues that will need to be addressed in that EIS when they start working on it. Hearing comments from the people, may bring up things that they hadn't thought of before,
Mhm.
or the applicant, or even the department, and make sure that those things are addressed in that environmental impact statement or EA, the environmental document, moving forward. So yeah, the comments are very important.
A couple other observations, though. This is divided into 3 Roman numerals here. The applicant submits notice and then submits a draft environmental impact statement. Just before number 2 is a huge undertaking. That is the preparation of the environmental impact statement. Now, I've come to understand that the transfer between basins of water in quantity is a big deal. And these achieving a certificate to do an interbasin transfer is a big deal. And lots of work goes into it, lots of public hearings, discussions, ultimately findings, fact. The environmental impact statement, is that is that tantamount to the application itself? I mean, is that totally of the essence of this application, or is it ancillary to the application that the applicant submits?
Yes, there's not necessarily a formal application like we think of other permits that people, like they want to put a pipe in the ground, you come in and you submit an application to the department and the division for that. The petition may be the closest thing to a real application. Here's what we want to do.
Okay.
And here's how we propose to do it. But that information is also in the environmental document as well. Because there'll be discussions in that document of alternative analysis. There's a lot of alternative analysis depth to those EIS documents. And within each alternative, it answers that question of what does this alternative say we want to do? Here's kind of how we want to do it. Those types of things.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. The final point I have, the findings of fact, the 9 points on which findings need to be made. This, I take it, is a quasi-judicial procedure.
Yes, sir.
And it is done by this commission.
Yes,
right.
That's the full EMC.
So, okay. There are certain procedures and limitations on how we discuss matters. Can we divert just a minute and Councilor Reynolds explain how a quasi-judicial procedure is carried out by this commission?
Certainly, Mr. Chair.
Pop question, but I'm sure you're on top of it.
Well, thank you for that confidence. I'll try not to let you down. Certainly, as specified in your bylaws, that's probably the best example of when the commission considers things quasi-judicial and when they don't. The bylaws do specify that things such as special orders by consent, as well as decisions on interbasin transfers are in fact quasi-judicial, meaning that the body is sitting in its judicial capacity, making a determination of facts and conclusions of law and ruling on how the equivalent of a permit is issued. Obviously, you don't issue permits the same way you used to, but interbasin transfers certificates are similar to that. And it's different than your quasi-legislative function, such as rulemaking, when you're making policy determinations and deciding how you would like to proceed or whether you would like to proceed. Instead, for quasi-judicial proceedings, you're basing your determination on the record that's before you. And as you have heard me give previously, and you're doing so in the absence of any legally impermissible bias, meaning that you're not making your decision on things outside of the record.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. That's helpful. All right. Mr. Brady and other commissioners, I have finally exhausted my questions. Are there any others? Commissioner Deerhead.
Thank you for letting me visit. I have a question about the environmental impact process. Is that following the State Environmental Policy Act or the National Environmental Policy Act, all the steps? Because I didn't see like a draft EIS in there.
It follows the State Environmental Policy Act.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes. Commissioner Duggan, who may or may not be a member of this committee, who knows?
I am.
Oh, you are?
I am.
Oh, welcome.
At least-
Thank
at
you.
least that's what
Okay.
someone suggested, so.
Commissioner Kelvington? No. Okay, okay, all right.
The public meetings that are held, are they held strictly within those two basins that you're talking about? Are they held on the state level?
Yeah, so all the ones that I've worked on, we've held them in the source and receiving basins. And you'll notice so interestingly, I go too far. Anyway, so it compels 3 public meetings in the source and receiving basin. So there'll be one in the source and one in the receiving and one
Right on the line.
where it, where another one where it's needed. Yeah, when you look at a lot of the basins in the state, if you were to transfer water, if you're talking about the Catawba and the Yadkin, or even the Yadkin and the Cape Fear, that boundary line covers a fair amount of North Carolina, and so they can be those meetings can be fairly spread apart. I bring up the meetings that we did for Fuquay-Varina last year. And so there was one in Orange County. There was another one in Cary. The one in Orange County was just outside of Pittsburgh. I'd say Orange County, Chatham County. I'm so sorry. Chatham County, Cary, and then held another one in Fayetteville. So those meetings can be fairly spread apart.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? All right, let's let Mr. Brady proceed.
All right. Well, thank you for those questions. So I think that segues right into this next one here. So there's one currently proposed interbasin transfer in the state going through right now, and that is the town of Fuquay-Varina. I gave a presentation on this back in November, so exactly 1 year ago. It followed the 3 required meetings from the NOI, and those were interesting meetings, like I hadn't never held before, been involved with before. They were all outside, and I thought they were particularly effective. It opened my mind up to what a public meeting, not just necessarily a public meeting that looks like a meeting inside a boardroom like this, but outside on a 18-wheeler flatbed, but we have great participation. So the requested IBT is from the town of Fuquay-Varina for 4 million gallons a day from the Cape Fear, source basin be the Cape Fear, the receiving basin be the Neuse. I want to reiterate here that this is from the NOI. So the notice of intent, I use a lot of acronyms, sorry. So the purpose and need will be in the environmental document. So a very detailed analysis of the amount hasn't necessarily been done yet, or it's still being worked on. So that amount may change. And in working on past interbasin transfers, it almost can be expected that number, once they do a real in-depth evaluation, would change. And I've seen it go less, and I've seen it go more. Okay, so this map, I know it looks busy, but it gives an idea on the ground of what this interbasin transfer might look like. So you've got the basin boundary that cuts right through the town of Fuquay. If you look in the middle of the map, you've got Fuquay-Varina. The blue line that cuts right through there divides. Cape Fear Basin is going to be on the left. The Neuse Basin is going to be on your right. The star on your left is the city of Sanford's existing intake for their water plant. It is right there near Buckhorn Dam, just downstream of where the Deep River and the Hall River, confluence of those two, which form the Cape Fear River. Okay, so the proposal is for the town of Fuquay, which is, like I said, in the middle, kind of in the middle of the map, to purchase water from the city of Sanford, and that line would run, that's undetermined yet where it would run, potentially down 42, but it's undetermined yet how that water line would go to serve Fuquay Varina. Fuquay Varina has a discharge facility, the Terrible Creek Wastewater Treatment Plant. That's the star on the right. That's where, and that's in the new space. So there, right there is a clear interbasin transfer. They're buying water from Sanford and Cape Fear, and they're discharging it through the wastewater treatment plant there on Terrible Creek that ultimately flows into the new basin. It is interesting here, Fuquay, like I mentioned here earlier, with a lot of the small towns in North Carolina, it's built right on that basin divide. You can see it cuts nearly right through the center of town. So part of the service area is in the Cape Fear, and part of it is in the Neuse. Right now, Fuquay Varina still has a contract with Harnett County where they both purchase water from Harnett County as well as discharge water to Harnett County through Harnett County's wastewater treatment plant in the Cape Fear River. Well, there's a lot there. Do you have any specific questions on?
Yes, would this be a modification then?
No, they do. Fuquay Varina does not have an existing certificate at this time, and
So how would this be defined moving forward?
this is a new certificate.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And it is Fuquay's certificate because it is Fuquay that's transporting the water across the ridge line and into another basin and discharging it there, not Sanford's certificate.
That's correct. Thank you, Commissioner McAdams. So the entity that is the applicant is the one that owns that water line that crosses that basin boundary. So since Fuquay Varina would be building that line, and ultimately the basin boundary would cross the basin boundary within the existing distribution system, which is all owned by Fuquay Varina. So they would be the applicant and not Sanford. Okay. So I mentioned last year I gave a presentation on the NOI, and at that presentation I gave a sense of what some of the comments were and all that. A little bit more deeper presentation than I was going to give today, but I can certainly answer any questions. So they're in the second phase of this project, which is that environmental document, and the consultant who's working with the town, the applicant, is still developing that environmental document. So we haven't received a draft yet. The next steps in this project really is that environmental document, which would include purpose and need statement in the document, an alternative analysis that would be provided within that document, and then all of the other elements that would be in a draft environmental impact statement. And we're talking about multiple 100-page document in these documents. They're large, and doing the modeling analysis to estimate what types of, if any, impacts would occur from this, as well as indirect and cumulative analysis on the project to see what maybe the effect to the receiving basin or the source basin would be from the additional infrastructure, the additional water coming in ultimately for growth in the area. So once that draft environmental document is received, there's an internal DEQ review. That usually takes months and a bit of back and forth. We'll review the document, send it back to them, revise it, comes back. There's a fair amount of work on both sides on that step. Ultimately, we'll end up with a draft EIS submittal that goes to State Clearinghouse. That's when the larger public will have comments. So I'll have an opportunity for comments. And typically, concurrently with that release to the State Clearinghouse is when we would have the public hearing hearing or hearings. The statute says there has to be one, but there can be more than one. And in the past, there have been projects where there's been more than one. It says determined largely by the EMC. The need is. The Fuquay Arena project is, those meetings generated much more public interest, like the ones last year, much more public interest than I had ever seen in public meetings before. And most of the folks a lot of the folks who came out were opposed to the project. Certainly not all, but there's a fair amount of opposition to this request, particularly in communities that are downstream in the Cape Fear River, downstream of where this proposed project is. Okay. Any questions? I stopped there during the map, and I'll stop now. Okay. So the last discussion item are these draft Interbasin Transfer rules.
Point of clarification, Mr. Brady, as you start out on this, draft rules, are these new rules that are being created, or are these modifications to a body of existing rules?
For the most, well, it's a modification to some existing rules, but we don't have many IBT rules as it stands.
Okay.
So a lot of this is new. Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of this stuff in here is new. The statute is fairly long, as I mentioned, fairly long and prescriptive. And so the need in the past for a lot of rules, or they just weren't really developed because the statute is just so prescriptive.
Okay.
That we've been working over the past couple of years, really few years, on developing some draft rules for interbasin transfers that take, certainly like all rules, they take the existing statute and then build upon it on a policy basis, how to implement those things that are in the statute. There was a Division of Water Resources stakeholder process for 45 days that ran in July through August of this year. Those stakeholders were all the water systems who have to submit a local water supply plan. Yeah, water systems across the state. It's about 550 water systems across the state. And then anybody who is already signed up and registered on this committee's listserv. They receive emails of any kind of notification of things, action items that this committee is taking up. 17 comment letters were received on those draft rules. Now, these are draft rules, and wasn't not prepared to go through all the details of the draft rules today. But to give you a sense of where some of the issues that we heard from folks were. So we received a lot of comments from water systems. It makes sense because we sent out to all the water systems in the state. So we heard from a lot of water systems. Also some citizens and other larger groups, and some groups that represent multiple water systems all collectively. So primary concerns is to better define the applicant and the co-applicant, and how their service area and the co-applicant's service area and the growth that we see across this state, how those are related, and how we can really better define and some, maybe even some flexibility in some comments on how to deal with this. Because so an applicant, as it is now, an applicant, when they come forward, this is these projects are done on a 30-year planning horizon. So the number that we're looking at, I should have mentioned this earlier, that 4 MGD for Fuquay, that's based on what Fuquay projects as a 30-year planning horizon. So in 2050, how much water do you think you're gonna need to transfer? And some of the comments we received said, well, we're growing so fast. how are we going to know who's going to, need to be a co-applicant and such? So, and we'll have to, all of these comments, we've been working on changing the language, refining the language as needed to make it clear and more useful, but still remaining with what the statute compels folks to do. That's key. Another comment was rescinding a certificate based on a newly available source. So that was mentioned earlier during that reopening clause. And there were some comments that have real concern about the ability of the commission to be able to do that. Once again, that's language out of the statute. But we'll work on refining language. The defined planning horizon, as I mentioned, we typically use a 30-year planning horizon, kind of always have through these projects. And the comments we received suggested maybe it could be less in situations, maybe it should be more. So those are comments. A lot of the comments we received was this last point here, because this is one point that's not well described and prescribed in the statute, and that is emergency and / temporary transfers. So we have a lot of, and we've encouraged water systems to interconnect. And so when you start interconnecting water systems, you potentially run into a situation where you're moving waters across basin boundaries. And I can think of several examples across the state for large water systems that do that. But they have those interconnections for emergency purposes. And those emergencies may be, it may be a drought, which is something sort of longer term, and maybe you can look ahead and see we need to have this in place before it happens. It may be a large fire that happens immediately, and you need to bring water over through an interconnection to put out the fire then. Also, a temporary transfer might be a known issue with a water main. It hasn't ruptured yet, but it's looking it needs some work. At the same time, it may be a water main that just goes all of a sudden, and so then that transfer of water needs to be moved over. So we are working on refining that language before we move forward. And I mentioned that mandatory water conservation measures. These are things that are in that. We have a approval limit sometimes in the draft rules, as well as the reporting, both before projecting what the water usage would be, as well as reporting after the fact of how much water was transferred. Okay, so I was on that for a while, sorry. The rulemaking schedule. Right now, the draft schedule would be to bring these draft rules to this water allocation committee and at the next meeting in January 22, looking for the approval to take it to the full EMC in March 22. In March 20, if that happens, then we will bring it to the EMC for approval to go out for public notice. As we've done right now, it was just a stakeholder process to solicit comments. The March one would be out for full public notice. So then you have April and June going through that notice and the hearing period, the phase. Then July and September, summertime, reviewing the comments and the draft hearing officer's report, development of that. So now we're looking at November of next year, this time next year, the final rules to the EMC for adoption. There's a note there, footnote, that's very important, that as outlined in House Bill 74, which is rules readoption, that the EMC deadline for adoption is March 1, 2023. So there's some flexibility in the time, but not a ton. So if that goes through in November, then in December, we take it to the Rules Review Commission for review and approval with a January 1 effective date of the draft. All right. Are there any? And I appreciate everybody's patience going through this.
We appreciate your presentation, Mr. Brady, very, very much. Do any of us have questions of Mr. Brady?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. King?
for clarification, on the stakeholders piece that you had, we had opposition. Were those stakeholders, were the municipality representatives or just general public?
For the most part, it was water systems or a group that represents multiple water systems or municipalities. You can think of it in that way. So,
What was their main objective? Just bring in just one main objective, if you can recall.
yeah. So the
Objection, I'm sorry, not objective. Objection. Thank you.
the thing that seemed to bring the most concern was this emergency and temporary transfer, the defining of that. That is something that, like I said, is not well prescribed in the statute, but is sorely needed for us to develop a real plan for how to deal with different situations.
Is that going to be applied in this moving forward? The stakeholders' comments?
Yes, sir. So we're working through those comments. We've taken those comments and are refining. I'll use the word refining the draft rules that we sent out to them.
Mm-hmm.
But both some subtraction and some addition of the language.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner King. Any other questions, comments? Commissioner Lazori?
I'm not on the committee, but hopefully I can make a comment.
We will allow you the chair rules that you may crash.
Thank you. Well, and just as a former member of this committee, I just want to say how helpful this was. I mean, these are really complicated, and we don't take them up very often. So really just wanted to comment on appreciating the thoroughness of the presentation. And I wonder if some component of it or a shorter version might be needed for the whole commission before the commission actually, when it gets to that stage. Because I mean, I've been thinking about this for 4 years, haven't been on the committee before, and I learned things today. So just a thought, and it does sound like this is going to be contended a little bit. So just wonder about that. But thank you.
That certainly strikes me as an appropriate suggestion that the whole commission be privy to this presentation and get their minds immersed into these issues. I also thank you for saying I've learned a lot today. I have the same feeling, Mr. Brady, that this has been a great presentation and very informative.
Thank you.
But are there other questions or comments? If not, we thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. And with 3 1/4 minutes to spare, we have run through the agenda. And let me ask, is there anyone else, anyone on the committee that has any other issue to bring forward? Suggestion? All right. With that, we stand adjourned. Chris Duggan, thank you. Welcome to our committee. And Jenny Kellington, we await any. Oh, is that right? And Chair Smith, thank you. You are on all the committees. So thank you very much. Good. We gained two new good ones, 3 with the chair. Okay. Well, thank you. We stand adjourned.